They told us to pack up our bags and head south. They said that the luck of the Irish ran out. They told us they burned down our farms and our stores. They cursed us for cowards.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. I'd like to remind anybody who's just joining the show for the first time tonight that you can catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on UCY.TV. Before I go any further, we're going to talk a little bit about Iraq again, about Iraq, ISIS, Syria, and some of the developments there. For those of you who tuned in last week, you'll know that there were some technical difficulties with the show, and the show was the new show that I had recorded for last week was not broadcast. And hopefully, and this show tonight is being recorded on June 25th, which is almost a full week before the show's actually broadcast on Monday night. So this is the way things tend to work out because of my schedule. I have to record these shows about a week ahead of time. But hopefully the show that I had recorded for last week was broadcast on Friday of last week. And if you tuned in to Friday, you might find a little bit of what I'm going to say tonight redundant, but I think it bears repeating simply because the situation in Iraq has not only dominated the headlines, but it's also incredibly important, and it could lead to some very dangerous situations. And in fact, we're going to talk about some very dangerous situations tonight. Also going to talk about Brzezinski and his plan, the fall of America, essentially. And there should be an article up by me about Brzezinski by the time you hear this broadcast. And the only way that you can find that would be to go search it at Activist Post or the Anti-Media, but definitely you'll find it if it was posted over at BrandonTurbeville.com. Now, listeners will know that I'm a writer for ActivistPost.com and the Antimedia.org, but they will also know that you should go to BrandonTurbeville.com if you are interested in my work specifically. That's the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all of the archive versions of this show, all of the interviews, and all of the other relevant information there. You'll also find a books tab where you can go on that tab and find my 6 books, and specifically The Road to Damascus, the Anglo-American Assault on Syria, which is relevant to the discussion we're going to have tonight. So we need to get into this situation with ISIS and Iraq. ISIS, of course, stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham. You could also translate it to be the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. The same organization, ISIL, Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. All this is the same organization. ISIS, ISIL, call it whatever you want. This is allegedly the spinoff of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and we're going to talk about who created that in a minute. But what we've had here is the development, and again, this is June 25th, 2014. In recent weeks, we've had the development of ISIS seizing territory all across Iraq. They've seized so much territory, they're actually on the doorstep of Baghdad. Now, I would be remiss in my duty if I did not bring up the interesting fact that the name ISIS, the acronym ISIS, is not by coincidence. The fact that Baghdad, which is historically the ancient Babylon, is being attacked by ISIS. ISIS is attacking Babylon. That's another road we could go down at some other point, I guess. But not to worry about all that right now. We got to talk about what has happened, and again, that is the seizure of large swaths of territory all across Iraq and reaching into Syria. ISIS has been a major fighting force in Syria in the death squad deployment against the Assad government for some time. Assad, of course, is wiping up the death squads. ISIS had this territory in the largely the northern eastern part of Syria. And that territory now, which was on the border of Iraq, goes from the northeastern part of Syria all the way across Iraq, all the way to Baghdad. And this is what ISIS wants. It's the caliphate. Now, this is the ISIS at the lower levels. Of course, the stupid idiots and the religious fanatics that make it up, the psychopaths that make it up, those at the top know a little bit more about what it's really there to do, and we'll talk about that shortly. But we have this seizure of territory. The U.S. government claims it had no idea that it slipped through their intelligence networks, that they simply did not know that ISIS was gaining so much ground. That, of course, is bull. That's a total lie. They've had surveillance drones flying over Iraq. They've got U.S. intelligence in Iraq. They've got Iraqi intelligence. They've got military intelligence. They've got a number of intelligence possibilities to pick up on this. And, of course, the Iraqi people, the Iranians, of course, have spoken out about it for some time. Assad could have told you that ISIS was making these power grabs. Of course, the United States did know that ISIS was making these military gains, and they knew that because they funded them, right? They funded them to do these very things. The question is why? Why would the United States and, of course, Britain, France, NATO, Saudi Arabia, and so forth, why would they fund ISIS to take over so much territory in a country that the United States could largely claim as a success, as an imperial success? Remember, for all the foolishness of the neocon Bush administration, from conjuring up lies to invade Iraq, and the resistance that subsequently resulted from that invasion, with David Petraeus and some of his cohorts in the intelligence and military apparatus, that resistance, the Iraqi resistance to the American occupation, was successfully broken. And Iraq, therefore, is largely a success of the imperialist notions of the United States and NATO, in the sense that the mission was indeed accomplished. A puppet government was set up. The United States was able to eventually leave with very, very minimal military presence on the ground, and still have this the possibility of rapid deployment to other parts of the world. So why would they do this? Why would they fund ISIS to take over and erase all of those gains in Iraq? Well, let's take a look at this, and we'll go into this here. We have an interesting article, and you can read my position on this. In my article, The Clandestine Reasons for ISIS Taking Over Iraq, up at BrandonTurbeville.com and Activist Post. But there's also an interesting article by Tony Cartolucci, and it's called "NATO's Terror Hordes in Iraq, a Pretext for Syria Invasion." And let me just read to you some of the things that Tony has to say in the beginning part of the article. All roads lead to Baghdad, and the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria is following them all, north from Syria and Turkey to south. Reading Western headlines, two fact-efficient narratives have begun gaining traction. The first is that this constitutes a failure of U.S. policy in the Middle East, an alibi as to how the U.S. and its NATO partners should in no way be seen as complicit in the current coordinated, massive, immensely funded, and heavily armed terror blitzkrieg toward Baghdad. The second is how ISIS appears to have sprung from the sand dunes and date trees as a nearly professional military traveling in convoys of matching Toyota trucks without explanation. And what Cartolucci is getting at here is that by calling this a failure of U.S. policy, that is essentially the incompetence argument, right? We go back to 9/11 when Bush was accused of being incompetent and allowing 19 Arab Muslim hijackers to run planes into buildings and outsmart the biggest police state in the world and the biggest intelligence apparatus in the world. Of course, it doesn't matter that those 19 hijackers are still, 7 or 8 of the hijackers are still alive. Doesn't matter. But Bush was incompetent, and by calling him incompetent, that's an insult. But it's an absolute, well, it's an absolving him of the blame for what really happened, which was an intentional MIHOP argument, right? Make it happen on purpose. MIHOP, M-I-H-O-P. This is what happened on 9/11. No, not Bush specifically, but you get the idea of what I'm saying here. This was the intelligence apparatus. By saying that they're incompetent, you absolve them of the guilt of doing it intentionally. By saying that the ISIS victory in Iraq is a failure of U.S. policy, that is absolving the blame of the fact that the United States funds ISIS and that this was all intentional. It also gives the neocon, the reactionary groups and so forth, the ability to stand up and say that the failure of U.S. policy is weakness, that they weren't tough enough on Iraq. Now, also, as he shows that there's the second lie that the U.S. military and so forth didn't know that ISIS was marching all the way across Iraq with convoys of Toyota trucks and so forth and military weapons. This, of course, is just ludicrous. It's also ludicrous, by the way, to say that the only options available to the United States are reinvasion of Iraq or simply stepping back and allowing it to fall to these animals, these apes. There's a third way out of this tragedy, and there usually is a third way, which never gets talked about because their mainstream media is going to give you a dialectic. You're going to get the left or the right, the insane on one side or the equally insane on the other. But what you got to realize in order to understand the solution to this problem is the fact that ISIS is actually a product of a joint NATO Gulf Cooperation Council cooperation or conspiracy that goes back as far as, well, at least 2005. You can see that connection in my book, The Road to Damascus, where this cooperation involves the United States, Saudi Arabia, planning to really ignite this sectarian war across the Middle East, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and Iran, in order to break those governments, in order to not only destabilize but overthrow those governments. And once those governments are overthrown, because you have a bunch of apes who would take that power, you don't have the human intellect that it would take to govern the conquered territory. You have fanatics who will begin killing one another on some silly religious disagreement. You know, you wear a red bandana on a Monday as opposed to a Tuesday, so your punishment is death, and you get constant attacks and infighting, so they cannot govern. They're incompetent. They simply do not have the ability to maintain power over a state and then execute some type of self-defense mechanism whenever they're invaded by a larger country or by a major corporation and so forth. This is the essence of microstates and mini-states. If you look at Libya, that's a perfect example. And that, of course, is the Brzezinski doctrine, and I hope to be able to get to that shortly. Now, given that ISIS is a product of a joint NATO Gulf Cooperation Council, GCC, conspiracy, what is the third way? What is the most realistic solution? The realistic solution would be for NATO and the GCC to stop funding it. You want to stop terrorism, you stop terrorism. You stop giving it money, you stop giving it arms, you stop training it, you stop giving it intelligence, you stop giving it guidance, and you stop giving it political support. That, of course, is the solution to the situation. But, of course, we don't have that because that's not the goal. Now, again, this Sunni and Shia question, right? We have largely, ISIS is largely Sunni. The Saudi Arabians, of course, are largely Sunni, and the Iranians are largely Shia. This is an ancient divide, Sunni and Shia, that goes back many, many years. And it regards some religious doctrine questions, which we won't go into tonight. But what I hear from a lot of people is that we need to step out of this because this is a religious war. This is a religious civil war between Muslims. The problem is it's not. It's not a religious civil war. What it is a bunch of apes who were funded by the United States and Saudi Arabia to go attack, the average public. You'd be surprised if you studied up on this stuff how similar the Iraqi people and the Syrian people are to the American people, in terms of what they want out of life, which is simply the ability to be left alone, to work, to support their families, to support themselves, and live in some type of comfort. You'd be surprised that this is the case if you listen to the mainstream media, but that's the case. The fundamentalist, and you get fundamentalists on both sides, Sunni or Shia, these are the ones that have been funded to attack the average people and the governments of those countries. This is not an accurate representation of the population by any means, and this is not a religious civil war. It's certainly a religious divide in the same way that Catholics and Protestants have been divided, but this is the funding of fundamentalists in order to divide those two groups of Muslims, and using the fanatics to divide what is largely a unified populace. Now, Saddam Hussein didn't do himself any favors when he doled out more benefits to the Sunnis, which were a minority in Iraq, which did cause some type of tension within Iraq. Now, you want an example of what that would be like. It would be like Jim Crow, although it was not to that extreme. But the idea is that you have this leftover hostility. One group knows that the other group once was given a better shake in life, and that, of course, is passed down. But to categorize this, Syria, or Lebanon, for instance, as a religious civil war, that is a mistake. It's something that should be abandoned if you're using that type of terminology to describe the situation in the Middle East. This religious civil war stuff is such a watering down of what's actually taking place in the Middle East that it's something that's repeated, for instance, on Fox News and on the liberal channels as well. It's infantile, and that's the level of propaganda that you get from these organizations. So let's look back at this. We have a report called "The Redirection" by Seymour Hersh, and this report explains. This is written in 2007, by the way. This explains that the United States is actually funding ISIS on the Syrian front. Well, I'm going to read you from that report. Again, this is Seymour Hersh, the famous journalist. And he writes, "To undermine Iran, which is predominantly Shiite, the Bush administration has decided, in effect, to reconfigure its priorities in the Middle East. In Lebanon, the administration has cooperated with Saudi Arabia's government, which is Sunni, in clandestine operations that are intended to weaken Hezbollah, the Shiite organization that is backed by Iran. The U.S. has also taken part in the clandestine operations aimed at Iran and its ally Syria. A byproduct of these activities has been the bolstering of Sunni extremist groups that espouse a militant vision of Islam and are hostile to America and sympathetic to Al-Qaeda." End quote. Again, that was written in 2007. So that shows that there was the knowledge, that we had this public knowledge of a plan to use death squads to target Middle Eastern countries, and particularly Syria. But we know this going back as far as 2005. There's an article by Michael Hirsch and John Barry written for Newsweek, of all places, and it's called "The Salvador Option," where he also talks about the same thing. So he even beat Seymour Hersh to the punch there, or they did. So basically, this plan goes back for some time, and you can also look at the reports which come from the U.S. Army's West Point Countering Terrorism Center, and the report is called Bombers, Bank Accounts, and Bleed Out, Al-Qaeda's Role in and Out of Iraq, and the other report, Al-Qaeda's Foreign Fighters in Iraq. And you can clearly see that these Iraqi Al-Qaeda and ISIS legions were created, funded, directed, armed by the feudal monarchies of the Arab Gulf, like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, Qatar, and Oman. And they were augmented with fighters coming from Libya, the terrorist centers in Libya. These organizations, these death squad legions, have been created again by the U.S. CIA along with Saudi Arabia and Pakistani intelligence in the late 1970s in order to goad and then attack the Soviets in Afghanistan. And you can see that Brzezinski, who we'll talk about tonight, was fundamentally involved in that. He was instrumental. He's the architect of Al-Qaeda. Now, the idea that we have funding for organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Iraq, that the United States, who funds the so-called moderate rebels in Syria, they are pretty good at realizing what force is moderate and what's not. This is the propaganda line that you get, that they can only fund the moderate rebels. Of course, there aren't any moderate rebels in Syria. I've done articles on that myself. Tony Cartolucci's done articles on that. So go check them out. But there aren't any moderate forces in Syria. If there were moderate forces earlier on, they're gone. In fact, the Free Syrian Army simply does not exist anymore. The 1, 2, and 3 in the chain of command are in foreign countries, hiding out. The moderate rebels don't exist, and they never have, except for maybe 2 days at the beginning of the fight. And trust me, that was not an organic rebellion by any means. Most of these fighters were foreign. So the moderate rebels, forget the moderate rebels. They don't exist. They never have. But the West would have you believe, or the media outlets would have you believe, that the terrorist organizations like ISIS, for instance, are being funded by Twitter donations and bank robberies, and that somehow has outpaced this international funding effort that's coming from some of the richest countries in the world. Twitter has outpaced these countries. Well, that is absolute crap, and especially if we live in such a police state, such a digital police state, where we can hack China and Russia. And the Israelis, let's not forget the wonderful Israelis, who seem to be able to get into anything that they so desire, have suddenly not been able to figure out who's getting Twitter donations. Come on, please. This is beyond belief. So we've done all this, and we still haven't answered the question why. Well, there's six. There are several reasons why the U.S. and NATO and GCC might be funding ISIS in Iraq right now to do exactly what it's doing. And one of the minor reasons, I would say, is the backdoor arming of these of ISIS with equipment like small arms, tanks, Humvees, MRAPs, and even helicopters. Right? That we had reports of helicopters being taken. It's the ability to arm these groups with heavy military equipment without actually having to do that openly, without having to say we're giving these groups tanks and so forth. It's given them the option to take the leftover U.S. military equipment in Iraq and then take it back across the border to Syria and use it there, which they've done. Now, what is more likely is that the U.S. and GCC and NATO have allowed ISIS to take over this Iraqi territory so they can justify the eventual re-invasion of Iraq, but also the invasion of Syria. Any deployment of American troops, of American airstrikes, or any type of military force is not only going to necessitate a battle between ISIS and Iraq, but also ISIS in Syria, because the argument is going to be that you can't allow these terrorists to use a border as a haven. You go back to Vietnam and Cambodia, right? This is going to be the same argument. You can't put handcuffs on the troops. So if ISIS is going to be attacked in Iraq and it runs back across the border to Syria, or if it's using Syria as a base, then you're going to have to go into Syria and just take the initiative and knock them out. If this happens, this will create the buffer zone that NATO has already desired early on in the Syrian conflict. They wanted this buffer zone, and once that's created, once they bomb into Syria, they will create a buffer zone that is essentially a new staging ground for groups like ISIS to conduct attacks even deeper inside Syria. Now, there's a third reason that this is happening, and that is Iran. Iran and Syria have had pretty warm ties over the last several years, and even warmer ties due to the United States' rational behavior and empirical behavior. But it's also warmed up with Iraq, and this is two states that have had pretty tense relations in the last 30 years or so, but they've warmed up to one another with the election of Maliki. So you've got the increase in close ties between Iraq, Iran, and Syria, and Iran, of course, is flying aid flights to Syria over Iraqi territory. If you break that alliance, and you have to do that if you're the United States and you have empirical motives, then one of the ways to do that is to A, conduct a bombing mission inside Syria, but B, you got to get Maliki out of office. You got to break the warm ties between Iraq and Iran, because if you do that, then not only weakens Iran, it weakens Iraq, it weakens Syria, because Iran is no longer able to fly aid flights to Syria across Iraqi territory if the new government is not as friendly to Iran as it's probably not going to be, because they intend to bring some Sunni and Kurd elements into the government, and particularly Iyad Allawi, who is the U.S. puppet, the open U.S. puppet. But you can break that alliance by bringing ISIS in and then justifying a bombing campaign. You solidify air superiority, and you can stop its flights. So we know that Iran and the United States have discussed Iranian troops inside Baghdad, for instance, and there is information that those troops are there. They are there in Baghdad because Iran simply does not want ISIS at its doorstep, and it probably realizes what the United States is doing in terms of funding these groups, and it wants to stop that. Of course, if the reason the United States has appeared to be warming up to Iran is, of course, publicly to state their opposition to ISIS while they fund it at the same time, but also to extend the Iranian military to the point where it's going to be weakened if there's an attack in Iran. And don't rule that out. If they engage in cross-border attacks against Syria, it's possible that the ISIS fighters could be used to justify an attack into Iran. And essentially the solution for stopping this terrorist march, and if you want to stop terrorism, then stop terrorism. Stop funding it, United States. Stop funding it, NATO. Stop funding it, GCC. It's Saudi Arabia. So this is the solution to it. But if you want evidence about who controls these groups, it's not hard to find. And for one thing, I want to point you to an article that I've got called ISIS Terror Group Controlled by Saudi Royal Family. And this was published an activist post on June 18th, and it's up at BrandonTurbeville.com. And essentially what this article has to deal with is the command structure of ISIS. So we got to look at this briefly. Now, we have this Abdullah al-Rashid al-Baghdadi, right? This guy was supposedly the leader of ISIS, and his story is supposed to be that he was an Iraqi Also, this guy's also called Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, right? We'll just refer to him as Baghdadi. He was an Iraqi who joined Al-Qaeda to fight against Saddam Hussein, and during the U.S. invasion, he engaged in several attacks against Shiites and Christians. He took over a Baghdad cathedral, and just in general ushered in this reign of terror, slaughtering different Iraqis and so forth in public as a result of this stupid Islamic court and so forth. And after Paul Bremer left Iraq, Baghdadi was captured and imprisoned at Camp Bucca, 2005 to 2009. And this is when Al-Qaeda in Iraq started to disappear, and they sort of blended into the Islamic Emirate of Iraq, which is another group, another terrorist group. Now, in 2010, Baghdadi, who was out of Camp Bucca, was named the Emir of the IEI, that is the Islamic Emirate of Iraq, which was at the time sort of in the process of disintegration. But after the U.S. troops left, or after the large numbers of the troops left, he started staging operations against Maliki. And one of his reasons for attacking Maliki was the Iranian connection, was the warming up to Iran by Maliki. So in 2013, after he publicly vowed allegiance to Al-Qaeda, he took off with IEI, the Islamic Emirate of Iraq, and went into Syria to fight, and he called it the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and the Levant, so ISIL, right? So we went from Al-Qaeda in Iraq to Islamic Emirate of Iraq to ISIL, and then it gets renamed ISIS by essentially the mainstream media. You ask yourself, why would they do that? So, this is the story of Baghdadi. Now, of course, we had a story that came out in 2007 that was reported in Reuters by Dean Yates, where they essentially, the U.S. military interrogators caught this guy. Let's see if I can get his name. I don't think they give his name, but we have Brigadier General Kevin Bergner, who told reporters that this individual, this fighter that they captured, told them that Baghdadi was actually a fictitious character. But that doesn't really matter so much, because Baghdadi's not actually the leader of ISIS. Now, of course, it should be pointed out that Baghdadi had been in prison, in U.S. military torture camps, for 4 years. And what does this mean? Why is this significant? Well, it's not that it breeds hatred against the United States. Once you go into Camp Bucca, Bagram Air Force Base, Guantanamo Bay, a couple things happen to you, whether you're a terrorist to begin with or not. If you're not a terrorist to begin with, you generally get tortured and turned into one. This is accomplished through general torture or through mind control programs, MK Ultra style mind control programs. But also, you get turned as a double agent. And these are the only ways out, right? You either work with the U.S. or you get essentially turned into a terrorist agent, a unit, to be used as a leader of these units and so forth in the Middle East and abroad. So this is where Baghdadi stands. But what we also have is reports, or are reports. I get my English mixed up sometimes. So we have these reports that the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or ISIS, is actually not Baghdadi at all. It's Saudi Prince Abdul Rahman Al-Faisal. Now, for those of you who might have listened to the show regularly, you would know that this is the Faisal family of Saudi Arabia. He's the brother of Prince Saud Al-Faisal and also the brother of Prince Turki Al-Faisal. And so this is a guy who's in control of ISIS. Now, we have here a report by Al Arabiya in January 2014. This is a Saudi-owned news agency, and they had an article and a video, but both of those have been taken down. But you can see sort of the the content which has been preserved. A death squad operative in Syria was captured, and he and his group had been following the movement of the Free Syrian Army. So he's captured. The Syrian forces ask him why he'd been following the Free Syrian Army and who gave him the orders to do so, and he responded that he didn't know or he didn't know why they had to follow the movement of the Free Syrian Army, but he did know where the orders had come from, and it had come from Abu Faisal, and that is the name given to Prince Abdul Rahman al-Faisal of the Saudi royal family. And the evidence, of course, is overwhelming that this is the case, that this is the Saudis and of course the United States and NATO control these groups. Go look at my article. I cite this at length in the article, where you can find the links to some of the mainstream sites where they, like for instance Newsweek or the Daily Beast, have even had to admit that the Saudis are funding these organizations. So this is beyond doubt. This really can't be argued that they are funding these organizations. So now, go look at my article, ISIS and Iraq to be used to justify invasion of Syria. And that is essentially what we've been talking about, but to give you the idea of how this is being built up to justify the invasion of Syria, we've got to look at what some of the mainstream writers have been saying. For instance, we've got Patrick Cockburn. That's really his name, Cockburn. Right? This is in the Independent on June 19, 2014. His article, Iraq Crisis Exclusive, U.S. Rules Out Military Action Until Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki Stands Down. And this is where Cockburn argues the necessity of a series of airstrikes against Iraq and Syria. This is what Cockburn says. The general support for the Sunni revolt in northern and western Iraq will make it very difficult for any counteroffensive, which would be facing far more opponents than ISIS originally fielded. ISIS now controls almost all of the Euphrates Valley from Fallujah west of Baghdad through western Iraq and eastern Syria as far as the Turkish border. Any long-term campaign against ISIS by the Iraqi government, backed by the U.S. air power, would require airstrikes in Syria as well as Iraq. The two countries have effectively become a single battlefield. Now, what did I just say earlier in the broadcast, what this is going to lead to? We've also got Anne Marie Slaughter, who's a former State Department Director of Policy Planning under Obama. She's got an article in the New York Times. New York Times, never to miss out on drumming up support for an invasion based on a lie. Remember Iraq? They did that then. You can still trust the New York Times, right? They're the media. They're not, incredible like myself and other writers. No, these are the New York Times. These are the authored news agencies. They wouldn't lie to you or anything, right? Another topic. So we go back to Anne Marie Slaughter. Don't fight in Iraq and ignore Syria. This is what this witch has to say. She's the female version of John McCain, by the way. She says, deciding that the Syrian government, as bad as it is, was still better than the alternative of ISIS profoundly missed the point. As long as we allow the Syrian government to continue perpetrating the worst campaign of crimes against humanity since Rwanda, support for ISIS will continue. As long as we choose Prime Minister Maliki over the interests of his citizens, all his citizens, his government can never be safe. President Obama should be asking the same question in Iraq and Syria. What course of action will be best in the short and long term for the Iraqi and Syrian people? What course of action will be most likely to stop the violence and misery that they experience on a daily basis? What course of action will give them the best chance of peace, prosperity, and a decent government? The answer to those questions may well involve the use of force on a limited but immediate basis in both countries. Don't they always? Enough force to remind all parties that we can, from the air, see and retaliate against not only al-Qaeda members, whom our drones track for months, but somehow didn't do a damn thing when they were marching across Iraq. It's funny, they tracked them for months and must not be very good at it. But also any individuals guilty of mass atrocities and crimes against humanity. So by this By this logic, then we'd also be seeing and retaliating against the Bush and Obama administrations, right? Because they're guilty of mass atrocities, crimes against humanity, but nobody seems to be going after them. We'd be going after Israel, right? Does this mean we're going to attack Netanyahu? Enough force to compel governments and rebels alike to the negotiating table, and enough force to create a breathing space, a buffer zone, in which decent leaders can begin to consolidate power. And by that she means leaders that are chosen by the Anglo-American establishment. Now, Slaughter, the appropriately named Anne-Marie Slaughter, has written on this before, and she's got an article titled Stopping Russia Starts in Syria, which was published on Project Syndicate. But she sort of, in this article, she kind of betrays her bias and her initial support for the Brzezinski Doctrine, as he espouses it in the Grand Chessboard, which I've talked about here. And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to get to talk much about the Brzezinski Doctrine tonight, maybe next week. But we got to talk about Slaughter and what she said in her article, Stopping Russia Starts in Syria. This is all linked in my article. She, I won't go into the whole thing, but essentially she argues an offensive geopolitical strategy and a targeting of the Russian Federation as well as China and Japan. But this is what she says. This is her quote. The solution to the crisis in Ukraine lies in part in Syria. It is time for U.S. President Barack Obama to demonstrate that he can order the offensive use of force in circumstances other than secret drone attacks or covert operations. The result will change the strategic calculus not only in Damascus, but also in Moscow, not to mention Beijing and Tokyo. So, essentially what she's arguing here is that you can't hit Putin in Ukraine because he's too strong. But you can hit him in Syria, and you should hit him in Syria. And this will not only stop Assad, this will not only bring about change in Syria, but it's also going to send shockwaves through Moscow, Beijing, and Tokyo. It's going to get everybody in line and realize the United States is still the imperial bully that it's always been. Or at least it's been since it took over from the British, the white man's burden. So Slaughter says, this is what she writes. Regardless of Putin's initial motivations, he is now operating in an environment in which he is quite certain of the parameters of play. That's because it's scripted. He is weighing the value of further dismemberment of Ukraine, with some pieces either joining Russia or becoming Russian vassal states, against the pain of much stronger and more comprehensive economic sanctions. Western use of force, other than to send arms to a fairly hapless Ukrainian army, is not part of the equation. That is a problem. In the case of Syria, the U.S., the world's largest and most flexible military power, has chosen to negotiate with its hands tied behind its back for more than 3 years. This is no less of a mistake in the case of Russia, with a leader like Putin who measures himself and his fellow leaders in terms of crude machismo. Well, it is time to change Putin's calculations, and Syria is the place to do it. Of course, this idea of crude machismo, where do I start? All right, that was Bush. But crude machismo, this is more propaganda, of course, and this works on this American society that is obsessed with political correctness and the feminization of the male. Right? You look at a place like Russia, and you see a culture, and I'm not trying to build Russia up to seem like it's some kind of paradise. It's a police state. It's economically not viable in the way that it should be. But the fact is, this is a culture where men still value masculinity, and women value masculinity in their men, and men value femininity in their women. It's pretty much the opposite of the United States, where we, as a culture, unfortunately, value feminine qualities in men and masculine qualities in women. It's the opposite of the way things are supposed to be. It's unnatural. While Russian men are learning to break down an AK-47 and put it back together again, and hand-to-hand combat, American men are learning how to wear dresses and be politically correct. That's not a direction we should go in as a culture. There's nothing wrong with valuing masculinity in men and femininity in women. That is the way it's supposed to be. But I'm not going to get onto that rant tonight. We've got to finish talking about Syria and this Anne Marie Slaughter, the female John McCain. So we have Slaughter here repeating the idiotic propaganda of these Assad's chemical weapons attacks, his killing his own people, his barrel bombs. Oh my God. She wants to cover up a geopolitical strategy as a humanitarian issue, and that is what she does here. She reveals herself as one of these responsibility to protect neoliberal Brzezinski doctrine imperialists, or maybe not even imperialists, but warmongers, I guess would be a more proper term to give her. That's what she is. And for all of the anti-war crowd, you look around and you see the old. 8 years ago, we had this burgeoning anti-war movement, which was going somewhere. But then they elected a Democrat, a black guy, allegedly, when we can get political gains by calling him black, despite the fact that he's mixed. We elected a so-called minority to the White House, and the anti-war movement just disappeared, right? Because killing is only wrong if it's done by a Republican. And that's why all of the left-wingers, the responsibility to protect people, the humanitarian bombing people, the Obama idiots, are now supporting war, where they didn't support it when Bush did the very same thing. So there you go. And of course, these mouthpieces like Anne Marie Slaughter, you can't really put them in a box of being a liberal and conservatives, because that's for the little people down there at the bottom to argue over. And this is Slaughter, her and McCain and these guys. These guys are winners, right? They're not little people. They actually know the score, or at least part of it. So this is what Slaughter writes. She says, it is impossible, and she's lamenting this fact, by the way. She says, it is impossible to strike Syria legally so long as Russia sits on the United Nations Security Council, given its ability to veto any resolution authorizing the use of force. She says that the United States should act anyway, unilaterally or multilaterally, by striking Syria and at the very least destroying its fixed-wing aircraft. In other words, do just what Bush did. Do it yourself or get a coalition of the willing and do it. To hell with the Security Council. I'm no fan of the United Nations, by the way. To hell with the United Nations in general. But it's funny, the United Nations Security Council should have power whenever they are trying to pass resolutions condemning Syria. But when the Russian Federation vetoes the NATO aggression against Syria, then suddenly it's time to act unilaterally or multilaterally. Wonder what would happen if some other country did that. Some other country who's not supposed to be respected, like the United States or Britain, something like that. She writes that the U.S., together with as many countries as will cooperate, could use force to eliminate Syria's fixed-wing aircraft as a first step toward enforcing Resolution 2139. Aerial bombardment would still likely continue via helicopter, but such a strike would announce immediately that the game has changed. After the strike, the U.S., France, and Britain should ask for Security Council's approval of the action taken, as they did after NATO's intervention in Kosovo in 1999. It's another illegal military conflict. Here's what Slaughter says. Equally important, shots fired by the U.S. in Syria will echo loudly in Russia. The great irony is that Putin is now seeking to do in Ukraine exactly what Assad has done so successfully, portray a legitimate political opposition as a gang of thugs and terrorists while relying on provocation and lies to turn nonviolent protest into violent attacks and then justify an armed response. So this strumpet thinks that apes running around beheading people and eating human hearts is a legitimate political opposition. She needs to have her head examined. Right? And of course, she doesn't believe that, of course. She's just trying to get you in Syria. You, not her, because you're going to be the one to fight it. And again, as I said, she betrays her bias. What you're seeing here, the shots fired by the U.S. in Syria will echo loudly in Russia. This is a stepping stone to Russia. This is a provocative action against Russia. This is the Brzezinski doctrine Go read the Grand Chessboard. You can get it online. It's not even that expensive. And he lays it out for you. So that's the situation as we have it right now in Iraq. Now, Iraq and Syria. But in the last few minutes, I suppose we should just go ahead and discuss this all the way through. It's important to look. I want to refer you to another one of my articles entitled ISIS in Iraq and the Path to Iran. And this dovetails with the article I did regarding ISIS in Iraq earlier on, where I talk about the real reasons for going after or for allowing ISIS to take over such large portions of territory. And I go through in some detail the political ramifications of Prime Minister Maliki's alliance with Iran and what that has to do with the geopolitical aims of the United States, NATO, and GCC, and so forth. So go check that out if you want to see that talked about. Now, today is June 25th. This is when the article's being, the radio show is being recorded, and today we just had the announcement that there was an airstrike in Iraq, in the western part of Iraq, the kind of northwestern part of Iraq, in Anbar province. That's the province that borders Syria. And this is under ISIS control. Now, reports earlier on came from the Iraqi media. Right, Iraqi sources initially reported that there were attacks carried out by U.S. drones, but the Pentagon denied that that had taken place. And then subsequent reports have come out and said that it was actually Syria who was responsible for the airstrikes. Now, keep in mind, it's only just a few days after the Israelis trumped up these lies and launched an air attack against some Syrian military positions. They made up lies about how, well, this teenager may have actually been killed, who was transporting some material near the border, may have been killed, but essentially Israel has released a statement saying that whether it's Syrian military soldiers who fire into Israel or who harm an Israeli citizen, an Israeli Jew, I guess we should say, and be specific, because the Palestinians and the Jews in Israel, the real Jews, don't have the same rights. So just a specific genetic makeup here. If they're injured, then it doesn't matter if it's a Syrian military soldier or a death squad member, they're going to hold Assad responsible for it. So they use this as justification to bomb some Syrian military bases and so forth, and some convoys and all that. But this only comes a few days after the Israeli bombing. The airstrikes, as it stands, are said to have killed about 50 people and injured over 130, but it's unclear how many ISIS fighters were killed, how many civilians were killed. We have State Department spokeswoman Marie Harf saying it wouldn't be surprising if Assad launched the attacks, because he's launched attacks against marketplaces and civilians in the past. Of course, that's crap. We don't have any evidence of intentional targeting of civilians. Of course, Assad has targeted marketplaces, generally the ones that were under the control of the death squads. And of course, a lot of innocent civilians have been caught up in the fighting and have been killed. But that responsibility goes on the back of NATO and the GCC, because there never would have been a conflict to begin with if they hadn't funded the death squads and sent them in. So at this time, it should be pointed out that at the time of the recording of this show, June 25th, it's about 8 o'clock, to my knowledge, there is no official statement coming from the Syrian military or the Syrian government to accept responsibility for the airstrike. But what's funny is that if they did do it, and I'm not saying they did, but if they did do it, it was only doing the same thing that the United States has been talking about doing for the last 2 weeks. Some people are more equal than others, aren't they? But again, it's important to point out that we don't know actually who did this yet. One wonders if it was really a Syrian military attack or really an American drone attack to be blamed on Syria and claim that it was an attack across the border. So we don't quite know what is going on with that yet, but that is the development on June the 25th. So I'm going to have an article out soon, and by the time you hear this radio show, I imagine the article will have been out, probably either at Activist Post and the Anti-Media initially, but definitely on BrandonTurbeville.com, which is where you need to check these things out regularly. You need to be going there regularly. But before I go, and we don't have much time to really discuss this, but I feel the need to get this out. Again, June 25th, and it's about 8 o'clock when I'm recording the show. You're going to be hearing this on Monday night. But it's important to say this. What we are witnessing right now in the mainstream media, particularly in the United States, but also other places in the Western world, is the setting up of a narrative that could result in possibly war, an unprecedented clampdown on civil liberties domestically, economic collapse, and bacteriological warfare. We've seen over the last 10 years, we've seen the hintings around that terrorists could be in the United States. We've been seeing this portrayed on movies and television shows. We've been seeing it hinted around on media outlets. But over the last 2 weeks, we've seen an absolute ramping up of this idea that death squad fighters and terrorists, fundamentalists who have gone to Syria to fight against Assad can, will, and are coming back home with the intent, purpose of committing terrorist attacks in their home countries, like the United States, like Britain, like France, and like a host of others. Dick Cheney, for instance, came out today, June 25th, and stated that we're going to have another attack, basically said that it's imminent in the United States. When, not if. And I tend to agree, and they would know because they're planning them. But I can see the rumblings of the creation of a narrative that will be the basis for a false flag terrorist attack in the United States that dwarfs 9/11 3 or 4 times over. This will be the biggest terrorist attack in the history of the world, the history of the United States. It will be blamed on Muslim fundamentalists and domestic terrorists, right-wing extremists. They will tie the two in. Mark my words. Now, I'm not going to sit here and claim that I know when it's going to happen, but I can see the propaganda being created. I can see the seeds being sown. This is what we are in store for. We've got to start talking about this now. We've got to start heading off the propaganda now, because this is very dangerous. It is likely to be of the nuclear or bacteriological variety. It will result in economic collapse, warfare possibly, and a massive crackdown here at home. You're seeing the propaganda being created now. Again, it's time to speak out now and head this off at the pass, because once it happens, there's not going to be any going back. The time for talking will be over. The time for talking is now. It's time to speak out now. And time to take action now. So please take what I've said to heart, and no need to panic, of course. No need to go get in your bunker and hide out for the next 10 years, but it's time to realize what's being planned here. There are steps ahead of us, several steps ahead of us. It's time that we get a little street smart and realize what they're planning and get a step ahead of them. At least not be behind the game. So next week I hope to talk a little more about the historical part of this this plan. We'll talk about the Brzezinski Doctrine a little bit, follow the United States, so hopefully we'll get into that next week. Going to have some big guests coming on, some very informative guests, people that I want the audience to hear. Just, again, please continue to check out activistpost.com, theantimedia.org, and brandonturbeville.com.